Most people trying to manage blood pressure spend all their energy cutting sodium and never touch the other half of the equation. Potassium works alongside sodium to regulate blood pressure and support healthy heart function, and lunch is the easiest meal to quietly build it into without overhauling how you eat. Here are 20 practical lunches built around that idea, including number 14, an old-fashioned, slightly unglamorous soup that quietly outranks several trendier items on this list, and number 18, a pairing that sounds more like a snack than a real lunch, but earns its spot for a very specific reason. By the end, you'll have a mix of familiar staples and a few genuine surprises, along with an honest word on who should be paying closer attention to potassium and who should actually be careful with it. Let's get into the list. Number 1. Baked sweet potato with black beans. A single medium sweet potato is one of the more potassium-dense foods you can put on a plate, and pairing it with black beans adds fiber, plant protein, and a second wave of potassium from the beans themselves. Sweet potatoes have been a dietary staple across the Americas for thousands of years, valued long before nutrition science existed simply because they stored well and kept people fed through lean seasons. The reason potassium matters here specifically comes down to how your kidneys manage sodium. Potassium helps your body excrete excess sodium through urine, and it also helps relax the walls of your blood vessels, both of which play a role in keeping blood pressure in a healthy range over time. Split one open, top it with black beans, a little cumin, and a squeeze of lime, and you have a lunch that takes minutes to assemble and holds up well reheated the next day, which matters if you're trying to build a habit rather than a one-time recipe. Choosing canned black beans with no added salt, or rinsing regular canned beans thoroughly under running water before using them, is a small step that meaningfully lowers the sodium side of this meal without changing anything about how it tastes. Sweet potatoes also keep for weeks in a cool, dark spot on the counter, so buy a few extra at once costs nothing in waste and keeps this lunch ready whenever the beans are. Number 2. Salmon with roasted potatoes. Salmon brings omega-3 fatty acids into the picture, which have their own well-documented relationship with cardiovascular health, while potatoes, skin included, are one of the most potassium-rich foods in a typical grocery store, often overlooked because they've been unfairly lumped in with less healthy potato preparations like chips or heavily fried sides. Roasting potatoes with olive oil and herbs rather than frying keeps the preparation heart-conscious, while preserving the potassium that lives largely just beneath the skin, which is exactly why peeling a potato before cooking quietly strips away a meaningful share of what makes it worth eating in the first place. This is a lunch that scales easily. Cook extra salmon and potatoes at dinner and portion the leftovers for the next day or two, and a squeeze of lemon over both right before serving brightens a whole plate without adding any sodium at all. If fresh salmon isn't in your budget every week, canned or frozen wild-caught salmon carries essentially the same nutritional profile and stretches considerably further. It's also worth pointing out that the sodium concern with fish usually comes from how it's prepared, cured, smoked, or heavily salted versions, rather than from the fish itself. So a plain roasted fillet like this one sidesteps that issue entirely, while still delivering the same omega-3 benefit people usually reach for salmon in the first place. Cooked salmon keeps for about 3 days refrigerated, so a Sunday batch covers lunch into Wednesday before it's time to cook fresh again. Number 3. White bean and spinach soup. Beans in general are a quiet potassium workhorse, and white beans specifically pack a meaningful amount into a single cup, while spinach adds another layer on top along with folate and iron. This kind of simple bean and green soup has deep roots in Mediterranean and Italian home cooking, where beans were historically an affordable, filling way to stretch a meal through the week, often simmered slowly with whatever vegetables happen to be on hand, rather than following any fixed recipe. Simmer white beans with sautéed garlic, a handful of spinach, and a light vegetable broth, and you have a lunch that costs very little and freezes well in batches, which makes it one of the more genuinely practical options here for anyone cooking for just themselves. A splash of lemon juice stirred in right before serving lifts the whole pot without needing extra salt to make it taste finished. This soup also happens to be one of the more forgiving recipes on this entire list, since it holds up well to substitution. Swap and kale for the spinach, or can cannellini beans for great northern beans, and the core nutritional profile and flavor stay largely intact either way. And since so many of these habits trace back to specific regional kitchens, I genuinely like to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment with your country or region, And let me know whether beans or greens like this are already a regular part how you eat. Number 4. Banana and peanut butter wrap. This is about as close to a grab-and-go lunch as this list gets. A single banana carries a well-known dose of potassium, and pairing it with peanut butter adds protein and healthy fat that helps the meal actually hold you over rather than spiking and crash your energy the way fruit alone sometimes can. Spread peanut butter on a whole grain tortilla, slice a banana down the middle, roll it tightly, and you have a lunch that takes under 2 minutes to put together on a genuinely busy day. One small note worth mentioning. Plenty of Jared peanut butters carry more added sodium than people expect, so checking the label for an option with little or none added keeps this lunch working in the same direction as everything else on this list. It's not the most nutritionally complex item on this list, but it's realistic, and a realistic lunch you'll actually make beats an elaborate one you won't. There's a broader lesson buried in this particular entry too, since a lot of people abandon healthier eating habits not because the information was wrong, but because every suggestion assumed they had 30 unhurried minutes and a fully stocked kitchen, which most days simply isn't true. Almond butter or sunflower seed butter work just as well here if you're avoiding peanuts specifically, and either swap keeps the same basic nutritional profile intact. Protein and healthy fat paired with genuinely potassium-rich fruit. Cinnamon or a light drizzle of honey stirred into the peanut butter before spreading it adds flavor without adding sodium, which keeps the simple wrap firmly in line with everything else on this list. A whole wheat tortilla, rather than a plain white one, adds a small amount of additional fiber and potassium of its own, another quiet upgrade that costs nothing extra. Number 5. Avocado and white bean salad. Avocados are one of the more potassium-dense fruits available, often containing more potassium per serving than a banana, which surprises people who've never thought to compare the two, since bananas have essentially become the cultural shorthand for potassium, while avocados quietly outrank them. Combined with white beans, this becomes a genuinely filling, protein-forward salad rather than a light side dish. Mash half an avocado, fold in white beans, a squeeze of lemon and some chopped red onion, and serve it over greens or in a wrap. The combination of healthy monounsaturated fat from the avocado and fiber from the beans also supports the kind of steady, gradual digestion that tends to keep you satisfied through a full afternoon, rather than leaving you reaching for a snack an hour after eating. This is also one of the easiest lunches on the list to double, since a single extra avocado and one more can of beans is all it takes to stretch it across a couple of days. Ripeness matters more here than with almost any other ingredient on this list. An underripe avocado won't mash smoothly, and an overripe one turns a whole salad brown faster than you'd like. So picking one that yields gently to light pressure is worth the extra 30 seconds at the store. A squeeze of extra lemon juice mixed directly into the mashed avocado also slows down that browning if you're prepping it a few hours ahead rather than eating it right away. Number 6. Lentil soup with tomato. Lentils are another legume that quietly delivers a strong potassium contribution alongside plant protein and fiber, and pairing them with tomatoes adds both flavor and a modest boost of their own. Lentil soup has centuries of history across the Middle East, South Asia, and the Mediterranean, where lentils were prized specifically because they cooked faster than most other dried legumes and required no soaking, making them a practical everyday staple rather than an occasional dish reserved for special preparation. Simmer lentils with diced tomatoes, garlic, and cumin until soft, and you have a lunch that improves in flavor as leftovers, making it one of the more forgiving meal prep options on this entire list. A batch made on a Sunday will comfortably carry you through lunches for most of the week, and lentils happen to be one of the least expensive sources of plant protein you can buy, which makes this one of the more budget-friendly items on this entire list without sacrificing anything nutritionally. Unlike dried beans, lentils don't require any soaking beforehand, which means this soup can genuinely go from pantry bowl in under 40 minutes, a detail that matters more than it might sound like on a day when lunch has already slipped further down your to-do list than you meant it to. Red or yellow lentils cook down even faster and softer than the more common brown or green variety, which makes them worth seeking out specifically if speed matters more to you than the heartier, more textured soup that brown lentils produce. A can of diced fire-roasted tomatoes, rather than plain diced tomatoes, adds a subtle smokiness that makes this simple soup taste noticeably more developed for essentially no extra effort. Number 7. Greek yogurt with dried apricots and almonds. Dried apricots are surprisingly concentrated in potassium once the water has been removed, and pairing a small handful with Greek yogurt and almonds turns a simple snack into a lunch with real staying power, thanks to the protein in the yogurt. This combination draws on a broader tradition, found across the Mediterranean and Middle East, of pairing dried fruit with dairy as a portable, shelf-stable meal, long before refrigeration made fresh produce reliably available year-round. Spoon a cup of plain Greek yogurt into a bowl, chop a few dried apricots over the top, and scatter on a small handful of almonds for crunch. It's worth reaching for unsweetened, plain Greek yogurt here rather than flavor variety, since flavor versions often carry a meaningful amount of added sugar that doesn't do anything for the point of this lunch. Greek yogurt also strains out much of the liquid whey that regular yogurt retains, which is exactly what gives a noticeably higher protein content per serving, and part why it holds up better as an actual meal rather than a light snack. If dried apricots aren't your preference, dried figs or dates work as a reasonable substitute, though it's worth watching portion size a little more closely with dates specifically, since they carry more concentrated natural sugar than apricots do. A drizzle of honey and a pinch of cinnamon can turn this into something that tastes closer to dessert than a health-conscious lunch, without changing the core nutritional profile in any meaningful way. If this list is starting to feel like something worth having on hand the next time you're stuck for lunch ideas, go ahead and save or share this video now, so it's easy to come back to. Number 8. Baked potato with cottage cheese. This one leans on the same principle as our salmon entry earlier. The humble potato is genuinely one of the most potassium-rich foods most people eat regularly without realizing it, especially when the skin is left on. Topping it with cottage cheese rather than butter and sour cream add a meaningful dose of protein, while keeping the saturated fat content considerably lower, which matters over the long run for anyone paying attention to overall heart health rather than just one single nutrient in isolation. Bake a potato until the skin crisps slightly, split it open, and top it with cottage cheese, black pepper, and chives if you have them. It's an old, simple combination that never really needed reinventing. Just a slightly lighter topping to make a genuine lunch rather than a side dish, and a low-sodium cottage cheese, if you can find one, keeps the whole plate working toward the same goal. A sprinkle of paprika or everything bagel seasoning on top adds flavor and visual interest without reaching for the salt shaker at all. Microwaving a potato gets dinner on the table faster on a rush day, but baking in the conventional oven at around 400 degrees for close to an hour produces a noticeably better skin and texture, worth the extra time on a day when you're not in a hurry. Pricking the skin a few times with a fork before baking lets steam escape as it cooks, which is a small step that keeps a potato from splitting open messily in the oven. Leftover baked potatoes, refrigerated rather than left out, also rewarm well in a toaster oven the next day and keep their skin texture far better than the microwave manages, which turns one baking session into 2 lunches. Here's something worth sitting with before we keep going. Several items still ahead outrank a banana in potassium, and most people have never once thought to compare them. Number 9. Spinach stuffed chicken breast. Chicken itself carries a modest amount of potassium, but the real contribution here comes from the spinach filling, which packs a meaningful amount into a small volume once it's wilted down and tucked inside the breast. Butterfly a chicken breast, fill it with sautéed spinach and a little garlic. Secure it with a toothpick and bake until cooked through. This is a heavier lift lunch than most others on this list, better suited to a day when you're meal prepping in advance, but it reheats well and holds its texture better than most stuffed chicken recipes tend to. Seasoning it with herbs, garlic, and lemon rather than a salt-heavy rub keeps the sodium side of the equation working with the potassium rather than against it. If butterflying a chicken breast feels fussier than you want on a weeknight, the same filling works just as well simply layered over a flattened, pounded breast and rolled up before baking. Either method keeps the spinach contained and evenly distributed, rather than sliding out the sides the way loose toppings tend on a plain grilled breast. A little grated Parmesan folded into the spinach filling before baking adds real depth of flavor for a relatively small amount of added sodium, especially compared to salting the chicken itself. Letting the finished breast rest for a few minutes before slicing keeps the filling from spilling out the moment you cut into it, a small patience testing step that makes a real difference in how the finished dish actually looks on the plate. Number 10. Swiss chard and chickpea stew. Swiss chard is one of the more potassium-dense leafy greens available, often overshadowed by more familiar options like spinach or kale, and pairing it with chickpeas turns it into a filling, protein-forward stew rather than a simple side. Mediterranean and Middle Eastern kitchens have leaned on this exact combination for generations, valuing chard specifically because it tolerates heat better than more delicate greens and holds up through longer cooking times without turning to mush the way spinach sometimes does. Sauté chopped chard stems and garlic, add chickpeas and a light tomato base, then stir in the chard leaves at the end just long enough to wilt them, keeping some of their texture and color intact. Don't discard the stems, either. They carry their own crunch and flavor and are just as edible as the leaves once chopped small and given a head start in the pan. Rainbow chard, with its brightly colored stems, works just as well here as the more common green variety, and honestly makes for a more striking-looking bowl if you happen to find it at the market. A can of chickpeas rinsed and added straight and keeps this genuinely quick, while dried chickpeas soaked and cooked from scratch add depth of flavor if you have the extra hour to spare. Chard also wilts down fast, so what looks like an enormous bunch in a shopping bag cooks into a modest, concentrated pile in the pan, which is exactly why it packs so much into a single bowl. Number 11. Banana Spinach Smoothie with Coconut Water. This one stacks 3 separate potassium sources into a single glass banana, spinach, and coconut water, which itself is naturally rich in potassium and has a long history as a traditional rehydration drink across tropical regions, valued for replenishing fluids and minerals lost through sweat long before modern sports drinks existed. Blend a banana, a handful of spinach, coconut water, and a spoonful of nut butter for staying power, and you have a lunch that takes less time to make than it does to eat. It's worth being honest that a smoothie alone tends to digest faster than a solid meal, so pairing it with something like a handful of nuts can help hold you over longer into the afternoon, rather than leaving you hungry an hour later. If you find plain coconut water a little bland on its own, that's exactly why it works. So well blended rather than sipped straight, the banana and spinach carry most of the flavor. Reach for unsweetened coconut water specifically, since some bottle versions on grocery shelves have added sugar mixed in that isn't obvious unless you check the label closely. Frozen banana, rather than fresh, gives a whole smoothie a thicker, colder texture closer to soft serve, and it's a simple way to use up bananas that have gone a little too ripe for eating on their own. Peeling and freezing those overripe bananas in pairs a day they turn also means a bag is always portioned for exactly this recipe. Number 12. Baked halibut with butternut squash. Halibut is a mild, firm white fish, and butternut squash brings its own solid potassium contribution along with beta-carotene, giving this lunch a naturally sweet, savory balance. Roast cube butternut squash until caramelized at the edges, and bake the halibut alongside it with a little olive oil, salt, and thyme, keeping the salt light and leaning on the thyme and a squeeze of lemon for most of the flavor instead. This is exactly the kind of lunch that looks more involved than it actually is. Most of the work is just letting the oven do its job while you handle something else. If halibut isn't available or fits outside your budget, cod or haddock work as a reasonable substitute here, since the goal is really the pairing of mild white fish with the squash rather than one specific species. Butternut squash also happens to store remarkably well once cut and roasted, so doubling the batch and keeping half in the refrigerator sets up an easy second lunch later in the week without any additional cooking required. And if you're the type who scrolls straight to the end of a list like this, don't, because number 14 is coming up soon, and it's an old-fashioned soup that quietly outranks several of the more modern-sounding items already on this list. Number 13. Beet and orange salad. Beets carry a meaningful potassium contribution of their own, and pairing them with orange segments adds both natural sweetness and vitamin C, which some research suggests may help with iron absorption from the beets. Roast or steam beets until tender. Slice them alongside orange segments, and finish with a light vinaigrette and a few crumbles of feta, if you like. This particular pairing has become a fixture on Mediterranean restaurant menus in recent years, but the underlying combination, root vegetable and citrus, has much older roots in regional home cooking, where whatever came out of the ground in winter was paired with whatever citrus happened to be in season alongside it. Pre-cooked vacuum-packed beets, widely available in most grocery stores now, turn this into one of the fastest lunches on the entire list when you're short on time. If you're roasting them fresh instead, Wrapping each beet loosely in foil before roasting keeps them from drying out and makes the skins noticeably easier to peel once they've cooled. Number 14. Split pea soup. Here's the one I mentioned at the very start. Split peas don't have much of a modern reputation. They tend to read as an old-fashioned, slightly dated soup rather than anything trendy, but they carry a genuinely strong potassium contribution alongside a substantial amount of plant protein and fiber. Split pea soup has a long practical history, especially across Northern Europe, where dried peas were a reliable way to get through winter months when fresh vegetables were scarce, often simmer for hours with a ham bone for flavor in traditional versions. A lighter vegetarian version made with just split peas, carrots, celery, and vegetable broth still delivers the core nutritional profile without needing the ham at all, and also keeps the sodium content considerably lower than versions built around a salted ham bone. Simmer split peas with diced carrots, celery, and onion in broth for about 45 minutes to an hour until the peas break down and the soup thickens on its own. It's inexpensive, it freezes exceptionally well, and it's exactly the kind of lunch that outperforms its reputation the moment you actually try it. If this soup showed up in your childhood kitchen, you already know, and if it didn't, it's about to become the quiet overachiever of your rotation. Drop a comment and tell me whether split pea soup was on the table where you grew up, because the answer's to that one split by region in a way that always surprises me. Number 15. Baked acorn squash with quinoa. Acorn squash brings a solid potassium contribution, along with natural sweetness once roasted, and stuffing it with cooked quinoa turns it into a complete, satisfying lunch rather than a side dish. Quinoa adds its own modest potassium along with a full set of essential amino acids, which is part of why it's held up so well as a staple across the Andean region for thousands of years, long before it became a Western health food trend sold at a premium in grocery stores. Have and roast an acorn squash until soft, then fill the center with cooked quinoa mixed with dried cranberries and a little cinnamon for a lunch that leans slightly sweet, without needing any added sugar, which makes it feel more like a treat than most items on this list. Toasted pecans or walnuts scattered on top, just before serving, add a satisfying crunch that plays well against the softness of the roasted squash. If you'd rather skip roasting the squash whole, cubing it and roasting it alongside the quinoa on a sheet pan works nearly as well and cuts the cooking time down considerably. When choosing one at the store, an acorn squash that feels heavy for its size and has dull rather than shiny skin is the one to grab, since a glossy coating often means it was waxed to extend shelf life rather than picked at its best. Whole, uncut acorn squash also stores for a month or more in a cool, dark pantry, one of the friendliest winter squashes to keep on hand. Number 16. Turkey and avocado sandwich. This one is built for anyone who wants something familiar rather than a project. Sliced turkey breast provides lean protein, while avocado, as we cover a few items back, brings a genuinely strong potassium contribution of its own, often rivaling or exceeding what you get from a banana. Layer turkey, mashed or sliced avocado, tomato, and greens on whole grain bread, and you have a lunch that requires no cooking at all, which matters enormously on the days when an elaborate recipe simply isn't happening. Deli turkey can carry a surprising amount of sodium depending on the brand, so choosing a lower sodium option or roasting a turkey breast at home to slice yourself keeps this sandwich pulling in the same direction as the rest of this list. A whole grain bread rather than white also adds a small amount of additional potassium and fiber that a lot of people don't think to factor in when they're focused entirely on the filling. Number 17. Edamame and brown rice bowl. Edamame, young soybeans still in the pod, carry a notable potassium contribution along with plant protein, and pairing them with brown rice rounds out the meal with fiber and a modest potassium boost of its own. This bowl draws on East Asian culinary tradition, where edamame has been a common side and snack for generations, valued for its simplicity as much as its nutrition, often served with little more than a pinch of salt in its most traditional form. Steamed shelled edamame. Serve over brown rice with a drizzle of sesame oil and soy sauce, and add shredded carrots or cucumber for crunch, using a reduced sodium soy sauce if you're trying to keep the overall sodium content of the bowl down. It's a lunch that holds up well cold, which makes it genuinely practical for meal prepping several days at once, and portioning it into individual containers on a Sunday means lunch is essentially solved for most of the work week with almost no extra effort each morning. Frozen shelled edamame. kept stocked in the freezer, means this particular lunch is available essentially anytime you want it, with no advanced planning or grocery trip required. Number 18. Cantaloupe with cottage cheese. This is the second item I mentioned at the start, and I understand if it sounds more like a light snack than a real lunch, but cantaloupe happens to be one of the more potassium-rich melons available, and pairing it with cottage cheese adds enough protein to turn it into something genuinely sustaining rather than just a fruit plate. This combination has a long, quiet history as a diner and cafeteria staple across the United States, often appearing on menus specifically marketed toward people managing their weight or their heart health. Decades before potassium content had anything to do with why it was chosen in the first place. Cube a quarter of a cantaloupe, spoon a half cup of cottage cheese alongside it, and add a few cracks of black pepper if you want a slightly more savory edge to balance the sweetness, or sprinkle of chopped mint if you'd rather lean into it. It's also worth noting this is one of the lightest lunches on the list calorie-wise, which makes it a good fit for a warm afternoon when a heavier meal feels like the last thing you want. Number 19. Tomato and white bean salad. Tomatoes carry a modest but real potassium contribution, and combined with white beans, this becomes a simple, no-cook lunch that leans heavily on Mediterranean pantry staples. Toss half cherry tomatoes with white beans, a drizzle of olive oil, red wine vinegar, and fresh basil if you have it, and let it sit for at least 20 minutes, so the flavors have time to come together, since the tomatoes release enough juice to essentially dress the salad on their own. This is a kind of lunch that costs very little, keeps well for a day or two in the refrigerator, and requires no cooking equipment beyond a cutting board and a bowl, which makes it a genuinely reliable option on days when even a simmering soup feels like too much effort. Swapping in whatever fresh herb you have on hand, parsley, oregano, even mint, works just as well if basil isn't available. Number 20. Potato leek soup with parsley. And here we are, the lunch I'd point to as the one that ties this entire list together. Potatoes, as we've covered more than once already, are genuinely one of the most potassium-dense foods most people eat regularly, and leeks add their own modest contribution, along with a mild, oniony depth of flavor that potatoes alone don't quite offer. Parsley, stirred and fresh at the end, brings a small additional potassium boost along with a bright, herbaceous finish that keeps the soup from tasting flat. Potato leek soup has centuries of history in French home cooking, originally a practical way to use up whatever root vegetables were left in the cellar to the colder months, long before any of it had anything to do with blood pressure at all. Sauté sliced leeks in butter until soft, add cubed potatoes and vegetable broth, simmer until potatoes fall apart, and blend until smooth, finishing with a generous handful of chopped parsley just before serving. Using a low-sodium vegetable broth as your base, rather than a standard store-bought version, is a small change that meaningfully shifts the sodium to potassium balance of this soup in your favor. One practical note on the leeks themselves: dirt hides between the layers as they grow, so slice them, swish the rounds in a bowl of cold water, and lift them out rather than pouring through a colander, which keeps the grit at the bottom of the bowl instead of back on the leeks. If you made it all the way here, you now have 20 real, practical lunches built around one of the most overlooked nutrients in the conversation around blood pressure and heart health, and I want to close with the honest version of what that actually means. Potassium works alongside sodium to help regulate blood pressure, and diets naturally rich in potassium, largely from foods like the ones on this list, have been associated in research with better blood pressure outcomes for many people. That said, this is not a universal green light for everyone to load up on potassium without a second thought. People with kidney disease, people taking certain blood pressure medications like ACE inhibitors or potassium-sparing diuretics, and anyone who's been specifically told by a doctor to watch their potassium intake should treat this list with real caution and talk to their doctor before significantly increasing potassium-rich foods, since for that specific group, too much potassium can become a genuine medical concern rather than a benefit. This isn't a scare tactic. It's simply the honest other half of the story, and it's exactly the kind of detail worth a 5-minute conversation with your doctor or a dietitian if you're managing any heart or kidney condition. It's also worth remembering that no single lunch, however potassium-rich, works in isolation from everything else going on in your day. Movement, sleep, overall sodium intake, and stress all play into blood pressure and heart function together. So think of this list as one supportive piece of a much larger picture, rather than a complete solution on its own. None of these 20 lunches need to be treated as rigid recipes. Either swap ingredients based on what's in season, what's on sale, and what you actually enjoy eating, since a lunch you look forward to is far more likely to become a genuine habit than one you're forcing yourself through out of obligation. For everyone else, the goal here was never to overhaul your entire diet overnight, and it's worth saying plainly that no single video, this one included, is a substitute for personalized guidance from a doctor or a registered dietitian who actually knows your full health history. Pick 3 or 4 of these 20 lunches that genuinely appeal to you, whether that's something as simple as a baked potato or as unexpected as split pea soup, and build them into a rotation you'll actually stick with, because consistency over months matters more than any single perfect meal. If this video gave you a clearer, more practical sense of what to actually put on your plate, go ahead and hit like, since it genuinely helps this reach more people looking for the same straightforward, honest information rather than another round of vague, generic advice. Drop a comment and tell me which lunch on this list surprised you the most, whether that's split pea soup, cantaloupe with cottage cheese, or something else entirely. And let me know if any of these are already part of your routine, or if there's one you're planning to try this week. And if you haven't subscribed to Healthy Roots yet, now's a good time, because we cover real nutrition science and traditional food wisdom every single week, the kind of practical information meant to actually be used rather than saved for later and forgotten. Sometimes the most meaningful support for your heart really does start with something as simple as what you pack for lunch.